Hello and welcome back. In case you missed my last video, we are going to be doing videos about Teen Titans, the 2003 original series, and every week I'm going to go through episode by episode, reviewing every episode of the original Teen Titans series and taking a look back at what made it great, what made it memorable, and going forward looking at the legacy that this show has. There's a lot to talk about, so let's jump right into it. This is Season 1, Episode 1, Divide and Conquer. This episode was written by David Slack and directed by Ciro Nieli, and the show was created by Glenn Murakami and Sam Register. Right off the bat, I have to address the episode order that we're going with. The first season has a few episodes in different orders depending on where you look. From what I understand, the production order lists Divide and Conquer as number 1 and Final Exam as episode number 3, although those two episodes aired originally flipped, so Final Exam was the first episode aired, and Divide and Conquer was aired as the third episode. The reason we're going with what I believe is the production order versus the original airing order, this is the order that's listed on the official DVD release of the series, and there's a few moments in this episode that I think makes sense for this one to be placed first in the timeline, and we'll get into that. The other discrepancy is later on in the season. The two-part season finale, Apprentice, Part 1 and 2, actually aired before another episode called Card Trouble. That was the episode that aired last in the first season, which is very weird to me because Card Trouble is just kind of like a random episode, so there's nothing about it that is very season finale-esque, where Apprentice Part 1 and 2 is like the finale of the overarching story of the first season. So that makes sense to put at the end of the season to me. So with that being said, what the fuck happens in this episode? This episode opens with this big concrete man breaking into a prison, and the Teen Titans arrive to try to stop him. And this is our opening action sequence. This dude is Cinderblock. He's a recurring villain throughout this series. This is his first appearance. He's kind of just a big, strong guy made of presumably concrete. Doesn't really talk or have much of a personality. He's just like a big, tough dude that the Titans have to fight. We also get to see some of the weird aesthetics of this show in this sequence. So for example, the prison that Cinderblock is breaking into has all these sci-fi stormtrooper looking cops that all have laser weapons and stuff. There's a lot of kind of weird elements like this that are, I think, to try to push the show more into cartoony surrealism almost versus pretty grounded realism of the DC animated universe. All the many animated series that preceded this show, like Batman the Animated Series, Superman, and Justice League, and all those stuff. That stuff is all pretty grounded. The cops are just normal cops. They use regular guns and stuff. Although a lot of the creative talent behind the DC animated universe carry over into Teen Titans, this show is definitely going in its own direction and doing its own thing, which I think is actually one of the things that makes it stand out and makes it so memorable. Don't get me wrong, I like Batman the Animated Series and all the associated larger DCAU shows and projects, but Teen Titans going in a completely different direction, I think really helped it succeed and stand out. Obviously, you also have the extremely heavy anime influence. This is the early 2000s, so anime was becoming big in Western culture, and so American studios were trying to figure out how to capitalize on that exactly. So you get shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender, the original Teen Titans, other shows like Samurai Jack take a lot of anime influence. But yeah, this show leans hard into the anime aesthetics. We even have Japanese pop rock group Puffyama Yumi doing the theme song. Teen Titans! So yeah, the Teen Titans arrive to fight Cinderblock. We get an action sequence kind of showcasing all the characters' different powers and abilities. And that's most of this episode is just kind of showing off and introducing us to these characters and what they can do. The team, of course, consists of Robin, Cyborg, Beast Boy, Raven, and Starfire. Starfire. We'll get into these characters more as we go. The main thing of note from this roster is that this is essentially the team taken from the new Teen Titans run by George Perez and Marv Wolfman. This was kind of the big Teen Titans series that rebooted the series and introduced Cyborg, Raven, and Starfire to this team as brand new characters. Beast Boy had been established as a Doom Patrol character before this, and then of course Robin, pretty much everyone knows him as Batman's sidekick, and he had been part of the Teen Titans before that, but this kind of like let him come into his own a little more. This is the run where he eventually becomes Nightwing, and this is a really smart roster to pull from because, number one, a lot of these stories from the comics were like really influential for the time. They were able to push the boundaries and do things that hadn't really been done in mainstream comics at that time. Also, this allows the show to really have its own unique identity. Like, Robin is obviously the main character that you probably know from DC, but in this show they just allow him to come into his own. Like, we get, I think, a total of 3 references to Batman total in this show, but then the other characters you've probably not heard of, none of them ended up appearing in any of the DC Animated Universe series, so even if you were a fan of those, these are new characters to you, assuming, unless you read the comics. But if you were a kid in the early 2000s like I was, I hadn't heard of any of these guys, so they've just felt like brand new characters to me. And I think that's one of the things that actually made this show so successful, is that it was able to draw in a completely new audience. You didn't have to know anything about DC to enjoy this show, and many of my friends at the time who didn't read any comics at all were fans of this show just because it was cool and they liked the characters and they thought the action was fun. They had no context whatsoever of the larger DC universe. This just felt like its own unique thing that they could like get on board with. So during this fight with Cinderblock, we get a little showcase of each of the Titans' different powers and abilities. I've never really vibed with this line from Starfire.
I am sorry to disappoint you, but I am stronger than I look.
It feels a little out of character to me. Starfire's whole thing is that she's an alien and doesn't understand Earth culture, and on her planet Tamaran, everyone is super strong. So the fact that she doesn't appear strong by Earth standards wouldn't even occur to her. It feels like she's talking more to the audience than to Cinderblock. But I get it, this is the first episode and they're still figuring out the characters. Starfire is written much better in future episodes. And then we have this moment where Cyborg and Robin are trying to pull off this move called the Sonic Boom, where they combine their different abilities, but they end up tripping over each other and fumbling the whole thing, which allows Cinderblock to get away and break out this guy who's just in a jar, and he takes him and leaves. The way this sequence is structured definitely feels like a opening introduction to these characters, which is part of why I think this episode makes sense to watch first. Like, when they first show up, they do a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 countdown of who they are and like, we're all here to stop you sort of thing, which is kind of reminiscent of the theme song, but it also like, hey, these are all the main characters that are in the show. They all get a little intro shot, and now we're going into it. Later on in this episode, we also see all these characters, like, theme song shots are actually taken from this episode, which is something that I never even really realized as a kid, that those were shots from the show. They just felt like unique shots to show off the different characters' powers as part of the theme song. So the rest of the stuff going on in the theme song is mostly just colors and letters and stuff. I love it a lot. It does a good job of using the moments from this episode in a way that makes them feel like they were intentionally designed for the theme song, versus other shows that's just oh, here's some highlights from the show. This feels like it was very intentional, even though it's kind of just doing the same thing. So again, that's how you can kind of tell that this is one of, if not the first episode produced as a theme song, had to pull clips from this episode. So Cinderblock brings this guy in a jar to this mysterious dude who's mostly covered in shadow. We find out later on in the series that this is Slade, who becomes one of, if not the main villain of the series. But in this episode, we don't even get his name dropped. He's just a mysterious guy covered in shadow with one eye. Maybe he has more than one eye under this mask that he's wearing, but we don't see that. And that's all we know at this point, is he's got some evil plan of some kind, and he's mysterious, and we don't know who he is. That's literally all we know at this point. Of course, this later on gets revealed to be Slade, And if you're a fan of the comics or of DC in general, you will probably recognize him to be Deathstroke the Terminator, who of course originally appeared in the New Teen Titans run as one of the major recurring villains of that series. So it makes sense to bring him into this show and have him be the main villain of this series. Now, why is he called Slade and not just Deathstroke? The reason is that apparently this show faced a lot of limitations on how dark they could go with some of this stuff, which is weird because they definitely go like super dark with a lot of stuff later on. For whatever reason, advertisers or Warner Brothers or whoever wasn't comfortable with having one of the main villains be named Deathstroke, so instead he goes by Slade, which is just his first name, full name being Slade Wilson in the comics. It's kind of funny because there's like this big mystery and buildup of like who is Slade and what's Slade's whole deal, when it's like he's just Slade. He's just named Slade. That's just his name. Although I think it works fine for this show because Slade is kind of a weird, ominous name in and of itself. And the fact that that's like literally all we know about him in this show is that his name is Slade. Like the rest is pretty much entirely left a mystery, which really makes him feel threatening and imposing and just like this mysterious dude because we just don't know much about him. And in this episode, literally all we know is that he has at least one eye and is wearing an ominous mask. That's kind of all we have to go on. He gets Cinderblock to open up the jar, and we get this line delivery from my boy, D. Bradley Baker.
I'm awake? I should never be awake.
I don't know why, but this moment is always stuck with me, and I think it's just D. Bradley Baker's like performance. One, it's like he's also kind of just doing his regular voice versus a lot of his other characters that are either like clones or like weird animals. So the fact that it's kind of just his regular voice, and it's this like kind of creepy, ominous like moment. You kind of feel bad for this dude who becomes this blob monster Plasmus because he doesn't want to be a bad guy. He just wants to not hurt anyone, and he has this weird thing where every time he wakes up he turns into a big blob monster. So this like I should never be awake is like, I don't know, something about the delivery has always stuck with me. Is like kind of creepy, and you feel sort of bad for this big blob monster dude. So anyways, he gets unleashed. And the team... Oh, right, I forgot about earlier. Okay, so Cyborg and Robin, after they, like, fail their sonic boom thing and Cinderblock gets away, they get into a big fight and Cyborg quits the team. This is one of those moments that, like, definitely feels, like, really weird, especially for what is essentially the pilot episode. We've barely gotten to know the Teen Titans, and then one of them leaves the team, and we're supposed to be, like, sad about it. There's all these, like, sequences of the Titans back at their tower, like, missing Cyborg and wanting him to be around. But, like, we haven't seen any of them interacting outside of that opening fight sequence. So we don't know, like, what the dynamic normally is. It's just, like, a weird choice to put in the opening episode, and I get that we have to have some kind of conflict, and also that, like, ties into the larger theme of this episode, Divide and Conquer. The Titans are fighting Plasmus, and at one point later on in the episode, and he splits off into these weird goop monsters, and they each try fighting one of these goop monsters individually. That doesn't end up working, so eventually Cyborg ends up coming back and helping Robin. They do the sonic boom thing again. This time it works, and look at that, teamwork and friendship and so forth helps them win the day. That's the idea behind this episode. And this is like early on in their career, so they haven't like quite figured out how to work together as a team very effectively yet. So that's like sort of the drama here. But it's definitely also just sort of weird to have like the first episode, we're establishing these characters, but then one of them leaves immediately. And then he comes back by the end of the episode. And like you don't really get a good sense of what these characters' lives are like outside of them fighting crime before Cyborg leaves. So it's kind of hard to feel that loss that they're like trying to like play up in this episode. Like there's this quiet moment where Robin is looking at this like workout room, and you see there's like a bench press that's like probably Robin's size, and there's like a huge one that you can kind of infer is for Cyborg. But because we've never seen like these characters do that before, it's like, okay, Robin's looking at some weights, I guess. I mean, in some ways there is some good visual storytelling here because you just have to kind of put it together. But it's also like kind of weird for this to be the first episode, and trying to establish who these characters are and like what their dynamic is, and one of them is just missing for most of the episode. The first season of this show definitely has some kind of weird growing pains. They hadn't quite figured out the tone and the vibe of this series just yet. Like, for example, we get a lot of moments between action and comedy that don't quite mix very well in this episode. We get a lot of like chibi style big head anime things when like emotions get hot and stuff, which are like kind of supposed to be comedic, but they're also like during these like scenes that are kind of more dramatic, when like Cyborg is like, you know what, fuck you, I'm leaving the team. We get all these like goofy anime reaction shots. So like the tone isn't quite like, haven't quite figured it out the balance yet. They definitely get better at this later on in the series. This isn't the best episode, and it's mostly just like some tonal stuff that is like kind of weird. But it definitely gets better as it goes. There's also some like music cues that I feel like don't quite fit the tone of the scene that they're going for.
Well, you're an oversized klutz and your feet smell like motor oil.
I feel like this show gets remembered often as a show that's actually like really dark and really serious and has a lot of moments for adults and stuff like that, and it's just not really true. Ultimately, this show is a very goofy show for kids that occasionally has episodes that are dark and serious. And the reason those episodes stick out more is because they're few and far between. Most of the time, the Titans are kind of just doing very wacky, goofy adventures, fighting ridiculous bad guys. And then every now and then something super serious and dark will happen, which makes those like moments hit even harder because of the contrast between that and their normal like kind of goofy adventures. This episode, I think, struggles finding the balance between those two sides of this series. But yeah, so Cyborg comes back and helps them defeat Plasmus, as well as he also managed to defeat Cinderblock off screen all by himself, which is kind of weird because I feel like that sort of goes against the theme of them like having to work together to defeat the bad guy. But whatever, that problem is solved, I guess. This episode's like a little bit of a mixed bag.
Look, sorry about...
Yeah.
So, are we cool?
And we end with Robin and Cyborg figuring out that this elaborate plan to break out Plasmus and use him as a distraction so that Cinderblock can try to steal some other thing is too complicated and elaborate of a plan for Cinderblock to come up with. So he clearly must be working for someone, but they don't know who yet, and neither do we. We just know he's some mysterious guy in shadows and a mask, and we get a little brief scene of him being like, "Curses, next time I'll get you, Titans," or whatever. We also see this old dude who like sweeps up Slade's cup after he like smashes it. This dude I don't think ever gets any dialogue, but he's actually a character from the comics named Billy Wintergreen, who is basically like Slade's Alfred. There are many aspects of Deathstroke that kind of parallel Batman a little bit. He fights Batman a fair amount of time as well. And we'll get into some of that stuff that comes up later in this series. But of course, to be an anti-Batman, you have to have an anti-Alfred as well. And so that's why Billy Wintergreen is occasionally around. What's funny in Arrow is they revamp Billy Wintergreen as being also like a master assassin and stuff, and I think he doesn't like have that threatening of a name. So there's like all these scenes in like the first couple seasons of Arrow of Manu Bennett that shows Deathstroke being like, "We have to stop Billy Wintergreen," and it's just like so goofy, and I love it.
It's so easy to betray me, Billy.
Well, Billy, you always had a good kick.
That's kind of this episode. A bit of growing pains in the first season, some tonal inconsistencies and stuff they hadn't quite figured out. But there is a lot of really great action animation in this episode. Some good showcasing of the characters' different abilities. I love how wacky this show can get with its animation. It's kind of stuff that you can really only do with like hand drawing, or at the very least it's stuff you don't really see that often, and stuff you definitely didn't see in like Justice League or Batman, the animated series. They're not afraid to like completely go off model with the characters, and that I think leads to a lot of really fun and wacky animation. And a lot of that stuff in this episode I think is really strong. It's more just the like overarching story stuff that isn't like quite there. And also most of this episode is just like they fight Cinderblock and then they fight Plasmus, and that's it. Not a whole lot to this one, other than like it's setting up a lot of stuff that comes back later. Bit of a rocky start, but we have a lot more great stuff to come. And this is just the beginning, my friends. There's a lot more to look forward to as we continue through this series. So that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you want to find out when I upload new videos, and hit the bell and all that stuff. We're going through every episode of Teen Titans. We're going to do one a week, so we'll see you back here next week. I'm also working on some other stuff. She-Hulk, big ol' She-Hulk finale video is coming out eventually. It's gonna be a long one, but it's coming. So subscribe and like and comment and all that stuff. I hope you enjoyed hanging out and talking about Teen Titans. There's much more to come. So that's it. We'll see you next time.